Welcome to our We Reach Biomedical Innovation series. This is the second session in the set of 4, and I am Terri Butler, moderator of this particular panel. We'll start off with introductions of our panel speakers. First is Salish Chihani.
Research. I was in Microsoft Research for several years, and one of the areas I was looking at was the impact that mobile technologies could have in healthcare, education, and making finance more broadly available. And I was doing most of this work in emerging markets outside of the US, but it became we started to get a signal that this was going to be the new computing platform, and that could be used pretty broadly for diagnostics, for all kinds of things. And so we started to double down and fund some projects specifically around use of mobile phone in the healthcare settings, all the way from diagnosis to care delivery. And one of the projects I funded at University of Washington, St. Louis, the other Washington university, they developed a prototype that could do ultrasound imaging using smartphones. And what enabled that to happen was, this is when the chip industry had been advancing pretty rapidly. So you got to the point where you had gigahertz computing in smartphone itself. And that's kind of what you need to be able to do real-time imaging that ultrasound needs. So we started to, show that prototype and the project all around, and we got lots of interest. People would line up after the talks to buy it. And of course, we would have to excuse that, look, this is just a prototype. And then we just sort of stepped back and said, well, this is a market validation. Clearly, there is a need here for diagnostic imaging that's affordable and accessible. So let's figure out if there is a path to commercialize. And Microsoft at that time was getting out of healthcare because they had sunk a lot of money there. So we thought, okay, we'll commercialize it. And then some of the clinics we had been showing this to decided to come on board as funders and also as partners to help us develop and test. And so, at that point, it was taking a decision, well, do you give up something that pays pretty well, is challenging, and then jump into the unknown and go without salary for several years? Now, I had done a startup before, which was a good outcome, but it was in the world of software. And this was a new field for me, but we thought, why not? Let's just give it a shot. So we decided to take the jump and started Movisante in 2009. So let me just stop there. I mean, that's kind of the genesis. And I can talk about a whole bunch of things that we had to learn.
Yeah, we'll talk about valleys of death and ups and downs and FDA and all these
one
nasty
thing I can
things.
say is, a combination of confidence and ignorance is a pretty good recipe for jumping in.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. So Joelle, let's go to you. You're kind of at the opposite end of the innovation journey. You're close to the beginning, but yeah, you've already come so far. So tell us about where your project came from and how you got involved.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me, and happy to share more about Cath Connect. So our project started in my mechanical engineering senior capstone class. So part of the engineering innovation health program, we worked with clinicians from the greater Seattle area, hospitals and companies. But basically, a urologist from UW Medicine presented to my team of engineers in the class a problem she was seeing, which was patients ripping out their urinary catheters and causing injury. And we made a solution for it. And so through that whole year, we did customer discovery and really understood kind of how the industry works with medical devices and built a fully functional prototype. But by the end of the year, we also had kind of started exploring how we would commercialize this. We did the business competitions at the university and had some success, built those first business models of how does this get purchased? What would someone buy this for? What would it look like? But very early on, and that was last June. And so from there, we had some initial traction. We did the Commotion Gap Fund, which gave us our first real grant funding, which let us keep going and turn this into something more. And so from there, I quit my full-time job lined up and started working on Cath Connect full-time. and the rest of the team, so they all graduated. We were all mechanical engineering students and stuck with it, started working on it as much as we could, and did the Jones and Foster Accelerator, did the We Reach grant, did the National NSFI Core program with Elizabeth, actually. And I've also worked with Carla as much as well. So it's nice to see us all here. But I'm trying to think more about this journey. We're pretty early on, but had a lot of success. We recently won the Seattle Angel Conference, which was an investor competition. And I think startups are really about making it work, and you really have to understand who's having the most pain from it, being the patient, the physician, and then also the payer. So happy to touch on anything more, Terry, if I miss it.
Okay, no, that sounds great. And congratulations on winning the Seattle Angel Conference. That's huge. I mean, only one team wins that. It's not like there are a lot of winners with that. And you have to be coachable in order to make it through their process. So, great story.
Thanks.
All right, Elizabeth.
Hi, everyone. It's great to meet you. My name is Elizabeth Johnson. I'm an assistant professor at Montana State University College of Nursing. I don't know if you have any Bobcats in your cohort or not, but if you are, throw it in the chat. I always like finding Bobcats. So my story actually starts about 10 years ago. So my classical training is as a pediatrics nurse at Texas Children's Hospital. And what I noticed in our phase 1 pediatric clinical trials especially was that our kiddos, sometimes who came from 2 to 3 hours away, would naturally go home between their clinical trial visits, which could take sometimes 30 days just to get them on a trial. So you can imagine, the condition that these children are in, that they needed to go on a phase 1, first in human trial. They'd go home, and then because of a lack of communication with their local providers, would sometimes be prescribed things they shouldn't be prescribed, or a treatment that they shouldn't have that would maybe cause a drug interaction or something else that would make them then not be eligible to stay on a trial. And I had one mom in particular who found out, that we had some off-label use of a medication from their primary care provider. And she said, "What did we do wrong?" As I was trying to tell her that her child was unable to remain on the trial that they worked so very hard to stay on. And it gutted me. And so I said, well, I need to figure this out. And I had a dad who said, well, I just wish we had it happen again to another family. And he said, I wish I just would have had you in my pocket. That made me go back, and I said, well, maybe I can be. How can I do that as a pediatric nurse? And that's where TrialWare was born. So TrialWare is a wearable device and a web-based platform that is the research whisper, if you will, for these children, so that it has concomitant medications, basic key safety information that those external providers may need while they're trying to figure out plan of care outside of a clinical trial. Many remain unexposed to them if they work in community settings. Our goal is to keep these kiddos on clinical trials. So from there, we've done the regional I-Corps, we've done national I-Corps, we won the American Nurses Association Nurse Pitch Competition, placed in a venture competition here at Montana State, and now we'll be going for a PFI with the National Science Foundation. So that's where we are right now. We've gotten some gap funding from the EDA, so a little bit here and there, and are now in a innovation hub here at Montana State. So gaining traction.
Yes, thank you. And boy, how frustrating. I know it's a real pain to get into clinical trials, and it's a pain from the researcher perspective to identify qualified patients. And so all that comes together, and then to have them fall off just by misunderstanding or lack of connection. So good for you. Okay, Carla, tell us how you landed in our mentor pool, and you have launched many products from your marketing stance, but tell us a little bit about your journey into this innovation space.
So thank you. Happy to be here, and happy to be with the group as well, of the teams that I've worked with. So I moved back from Switzerland a couple of years ago and was looking for something to do. I had always been interested in tech transfer and technology and going to market and supporting startups back from Houston all along to Switzerland and then back in the States, and also work with an incubator out of Nova Scotia. So the innovation I love, both from an entrepreneurial standpoint. I started with a startup, and then when I moved on to a multinational, was always known for keeping an entrepreneurial spirit and really thinking about how can you drive innovation in the 800-pound gorilla and drive forward innovation, whether there's venture funding or seeking new type of funding. So I was looking for something to do, joined ICOR last June. I think that's where I met Joelle, so it's amazing. And Elizabeth, was it that first cohort? Wow. And so it's just amazing to see how everyone's embraced the journey and, you know, going along and made so much progress. And it really is rewarding to me on a personal level also to pass on learnings from upstream, downstream. And I've worked in global markets, both from a medical device as well as diagnostics.
Thank you. Great. So actually, Carla, you may be a good one to start with. One of my first questions is about business models. This particular session is sort of surrounding business models, because you have to have a valid business model in order for investors or grantors to buy in that you're on the path to something that will actually be used. So what types of business models do you see in healthcare, Carla?
You know, I think it's interesting. I've worked, as I mentioned, in both the startup and the multinational, and it's, you know, we've had an evolution over the last, I would say, 10 years and almost even the last couple of years of ensuring that we keep the patient first and foremost central. You know, I think we used to always talk about customer centricity. And for me, it's all about the patient and patient engagement. And now we're seeing also patient preference and the role the patient has in decision and reimbursement. So, you know, business models that are sound on the problem and the solution and validating that from a customer discovery standpoint. You know, and then you can determine the go-to-market strategy, whether it's through a distribution. You know, I've worked in a group where we had a distribution when I was at my first startup with a multinational with Medtronic. And then we kept the distribution and sales arrangement for primary care and built out our own sales team. And then, so I think it's really thinking about, you know, what is your go-to-market? Do you have a strong problem and solution? And validating, you know, the customer assumptions that you have through tons and tons and tons of customer discovery. And the teams will hear me say diverse. It's not just the University of Washington. It's not just Seattle. You know, thinking about the point of care for delivery and how can we advance that point of care to broaden access, you know, particularly in the US and globally, so that we have equitable access to healthcare.
Great. So you had different channels for different people, different customer bases, as well as different channels for different partners, depending on who their customer base was.
Right. And I think the team has heard me and several, follow the money. You have to validate who's going to pay for it, because you can build a fantastic item, and if no one's going to buy it, and it's really challenging the assumptions, because there are a lot of people that'll say, yeah, that's great, I'll buy it. But then when it comes to it from a healthcare, we've got our clinical decision makers, our operational decision makers, and our financial. And I think that's something I'd like to commend Joelle and Elizabeth, is really they thought about what is the problem for and what are the needs of each of these decision makers and how do I fulfill their needs.
Yeah, great. Thank you. So Salish, who are the customers of Mobisanti today?
Well, so I think if I may just add a couple of things to what Carla mentioned. I mean, she laid out, like, you have to understand all the stakeholders. You have the payers, the clinicians, and the patients. I think the other thing that we need to keep in mind is, for all practical purposes, the healthcare system in the US is a fee-for-service, for-profit enterprise. Even the hospitals that are nominally not-for-profit, they're being run in a way that it's really a for-profit enterprise. So you have to understand that and not be bogged down by all the noise around value-based care and shift and everything. We discovered that less than 10% of the revenues are actually coming from value-based. It's still fee-for-service. So that's the reality check number one. And you know, and the other thing, and because of that, drives a lot of distortions, which can sometimes and very often actually can completely go against the notion of, is something more affordable or accessible. That may not be a good thing from the point of view of hospital administrators and the CFOs for what they're trying to optimize. So, and when you're new to healthcare, that comes as a shock and a disappointment, because most of us get into that space because we want to have a positive impact on people, right? And the reality is a lot more complicated, navigable, but it's complicated. And I think it's important to understand that. So you're asking what happened to, where is Mobisante? So
Yes. And what did you think? I guess you could tell us a little more about how you figured out who the
well,
customers
so
were.
we went through the classic market discovery process. Our initial hypothesis was, well, this would be very useful for ER docs, because kind of things we could do, the so-called fast exams to do rule outs for major issues. I mean, you can do it in the field, you could do it quickly without having to wait for machines to be brought in if you're in the ER, right? And we did all these studies. I spent a lot of time in Harvard Review. We thought, okay, this is it, this is a segment. And so clinicians on board, patients, absolutely, everything is fine. It's just a minor issue. In order to sell to that constituency, you have to sell to hospitals. And if you have dealt with hospitals, you're talking about a sales cycle that's 18 months to 24 months if you're lucky, and all of them will do their own pilots because they think they're so unique that whatever data you have from any other system is not going to work. So we did that, spent some time, realized that's not it. Then we decided to go after orthopedics market. Very clear value proposition. You're doing cortisol injections and things like that. You can do guided procedures using our device. You get close to 100% accuracy. Great. And at that point, CMS decided they were looking at devices like ours, saying, hey, we put our CPT codes and reimbursement based on devices that cost 10 times as much. We need to scale that back. So suddenly the reimbursement for those things went from a couple of $100 to $30. Well, that was the end of that business. Okay. So the third one we converged on was really primary care. Right. And for a couple of reasons, because there was also starting to be a push to train family practice and general practitioners in the use of imaging to be able to do things on site. And, our partners, community clinics, they were moving to a capitated model where they had an incentive to do some of this themselves. So we thought, okay, we will double down and go after that segment. But most of the value creation would have happened if the world had actually, or, based on how quickly did the world move to value-based care. And for community clinics and folks like special ops and others, I mean, we still were compelling enough, right? But the pace in which the market would develop was going to be determined by value-based care. And that was a slow pace. So we ended up selling the company to a private equity, which had the wherewithal and the ability to stay in the game long enough for those things to happen.
Oh, that's great. Yeah. So that's where the capital ended up coming up.
Yeah.
For
And I think, so the
last
reason I
leg.
mentioned some of this journey is because you have to be prepared to do some market discovery and resets, and you still have to stay in the game, which means you have to have capital. You don't want to use up all your money in your first shot, right? So navigating that is part of the fun, or it's also the reason I blame my hair loss on.
Yeah, the ulcers and hair loss.
But I think if I can just add, Salish, I think that's a good point, because I think it's, if you have the strong targeting and segmentation of your customer base, right? Because there's some that are going to be the low-hanging fruit, if it's applicable, that are group practices, maybe private practice, that you can get the buying, and then they're generating revenue for you to keep afloat, right? While at the same time, working with the universities or the larger healthcare systems that take, 16 to 18 months. And then not only is it fee for service, it's the cheapest fee for service, right? We're trying to think of ways to cut costs and then have supply chain optimization, whether it's Vizient or HCA. And, for those of you that are new, they're all thinking about how can we negotiate big contracts for the hospital and get it as cheap as possible. And it's not always, unfortunately, maybe the best option, but is it the cheap? So you have to kind of think about those different buyers. And I think that's a great point, Salish, that you raised.
And absolutely. And if I may just add to that, because you have seen a fair amount of consolidation of hospital systems, their ability to actually buy things from smaller companies or buy point solutions has more or less disappeared, which means you're having to work with some other big entity that will be coming in as a prime contractor or the procurement, and that's a totally different game altogether. So it's actually become very, very difficult for startups and companies that have point solutions to engage in any meaningful way. I mean, you can go through the big players, the Medtronics, the GEs of the world, but they will be the prime contractors and they'll take the big cut and you'll be left with a little bit. So just keep that in.
It better be worth it anyway. So jumping to a different business model. Thank you, you two. Elizabeth, your customers are, who are your customers? Is it the pharma companies or trial sites?
So it can be both for investigator initiative or really large hospital systems that are conducting a significant amount of their research. So your Mayo clinics, your Duke, clinical research, Seattle Clinical Research Institute. But
So it's an armband, right, that fastens onto the patient. So it looks like a Fitbit or something.
It does. And then it has some sound reactivity to it, so it can flash and get the attention if you're in the emergency department. And it has some near field communication. So it'll pop up on the nurse's unit phones and say, oh, you're a clinical trial participant, click here. And it'll open up to some authentication, some encryption that will then open them up to a bit about the study, but just enough de-identified so that they can take care of them quickly during triage and just keep them on the study. So our other customers, definitively pharmaceutical companies who are looking to have this utilized as we're expanding geographic equity for opportunity for access in clinical trials where they may not have as much experience keeping those individuals safe. So in our rural frontier communities, among our underrepresented or underserved, would be a great opportunity to help additional buffers with their safety management plans.
So does whoever the purchaser is, say it's a pharma company, do they outfit the local emergency rooms that are nearby with information for the nurses, or how does that interaction happen?
Absolutely. So they would give these to the trial sites as part of their study startup. So essentially as part of their safety management plan that they submit to the FDA as part of their protocol. And I speak from experience. I was over on the pharma side for about 6 years. So I saw it, I saw the blueprints, if you will. And so once you submit that is when you're able to develop your safety management plan. They would be able to distribute this to their research sites. So as they're enrolling their trial participants, the research nurses can educate them on their safety, why we're using these, why it's important for the families, and also education letters and training decks that those sites can then do for their regional hospitals that are around them to give them a quick heads up about these trial participants and what they may see on their wrist should they ever come in at 3 o'clock in the morning, with fever or nausea. So they understand that there's a little bit more of a unique complex to these kids. So that nausea may be something else, or we call it normal abnormals. Yep.
Thank you. And so I guess I'm interested in what made you actually do this. You saw the problem and you'd worked some in pharma. And so what instigated you to take action?
Honestly, because nobody else was. There's only so much you can see. After I worked in pediatric research, I decided to take a break and went to cancer. And so went to adult and community and early phase cancer, and then decided to go to some of the worst cancer, which is acute myeloid leukemia phase 1. Started going into more deeper, more complex, where honestly, we just want to give these people sometimes time for closure. Or, I had one patient who just wanted to go to the grocery store one last time with his wife, like they used to for 30 years. And to see them kind of robbed of time from something as simple as an effective communication broke my heart as a nurse. And so it actually helped me. I pursued my PhD for this specific reason. So that's why I went for it. I also had a personal experience where my mom got diagnosed with breast cancer and had an adverse event happen at a regional hospital because she was 3 hours away from her clinical facility. And I made a bedside promise, not knowing she was going to make it through the night. And so this was also a promise fulfilled. that it wouldn't happen to somebody else again, like we saw it happen to her and the thousands of people that it happens to every year, unfortunately. So I'm starting with the children here just because they honestly don't have a lot of opportunities elsewise. 60% of our kids in the US go straight to clinical trials when they have cancer. So we need to make sure that all of them are kept safe, since this is sometimes their only option for standard of care.
Great. Wow. Thank you. That is inspiring. So Joelle, you've had a lot of questions along your journey as far as exactly where, well, first describe a little bit more detail on how Cath Connect looks as a device with you guys today. And then that has evolved a bit because of questions about where and when it would be used. Is that right?
I want to make sure I'm answering kind of the entirety of that question, but I'll also add on to Carlin's question, just say like customer discovery never really ends. It's always nice to continue that process with whatever you're doing, whatever your kind of business milestones are, to continue asking for those unanswered questions, and also knowing what you don't know so you can have those questions answered over time for people you meet and network with. But the Cath Connect product, I guess it started with that one urologist, and through the year we interviewed a lot of people just to understand really the clinical setting from engineering perspective that's not in the hospital and haven't ever seen all of those roles before. And when we did the summer program, we also expanded to other networks, understanding the major hospital, like a public or private facility, and also the rural side, and where you can make things more accessible with less resources. And also long-term care, nursing homes, skilled nursing centers to go on. But with our device, we really had to understand expanding from one story to validating that across all the different users. So urologists, but also there's emergency units, cardiology, nurses are the end users, but they might not be the purchasers. Those would be the hospital. I think there's a lot of players that you may not realize, and it kind of grows over time, that ecosystem map. And I think it really helps to focus on who's going to be that first buyer, what's that first segment. We narrowed our device down to just the delirious patients, those with altered mental status from dementia or confusion from medicine, and that are post-surgical, primarily in urology and cardiology. So narrowing that down, but knowing that there's potential to all urology patients with a catheter has been super helpful for us to determine our business model and see who we're going to present our device to as a customer, and for what research we're going to do as well to present it at conferences.
And a pretty high percent of patients who are being treated in a hospital do get the urinary catheters, and don't they? They don't get them up to go to the restroom on a regular basis. They avoid it. So they put in catheters, and then people are squiggling around and can pull the thing out. Super painful and a big health risk. So what does your device look like, and who would install it?
Yeah, so I'll just add, there's 30 million catheter replacements each year. It's a pretty common just tube that's used for anyone that can't drain urine for hours or days, either in surgery or out of the surgical setting. But our device is a accessory that gets installed into the tube and lets it disconnect. So when it gets pulled from like the 4 to 6 feet of tubing, it won't rip out this balloon that's in the bladder as part of the placement and won't cause any damage. So it leaves this internal portion and has an external portion that can safely be disconnected. And we call it an accessory because it uses the existing tubing, and it's kind of a simple feature that does have more complexity to it, but we also compare it to a kind of a MagSafe like computer charger or gasoline pump that disconnects if you drive off with it in your car. And it's just, built by engineers at the UW. So very simple, but had a lot of support along the way to make sure we addressed all user needs.
And I guess I can slip in a question. Were you surprised when you started to learn about what would be required for FDA clearance?
Yes, very surprised. Also, I think of it kind of as a pie chart. We have our regulatory, which breaks down into FDA and QMS, and kind of every even it spreads into the marketing intersection where like the labels and the packaging, how you present the evidence you're going to claim and using that towards providers, but also then there's reimbursement and that has its own beast and that goes into the purchasers and the customers and how you're going to sell it. So you have to have a pretty good understanding of that wheel of components and where they intersect and make sure you understand where you can fill the gaps.
So a team
So
is
it's
being told they need to do this, that, and the other thing, and then they need to do additional things and need more experts. How in the world do they develop budgets and who do they go to bat ideas around for how much funding they're going to need to get something to move along?
Salish, okay, I'll go first. So if you get a template, there's a million templates. So I think Joelle was going through the Foster program and I was looking through my resources at the time for a template and then she found one. So ask, you start with a very basic, thinking about your costs. I think thinking about the business model, you have to always think about what, how much of course is it going to cost to build, the manufacturing, taking into consideration any risks that you may have from a cost and supplier perspective, but then really breaking down like what is the customer acquisition cost going to be? How are people going to hear about it? How will they then introduce it? What's the time? The cost of your sales team, if you're using a sales team to go in repeatedly, because it's difficult. It's more difficult to get from a healthcare system in, where we used to be able just to drop by an office or drop into a hospital. It's becoming much more complex. So really don't estimate your customer acquisition costs and don't overestimate how quickly you will adopt, because I think a lot of times that can be a watch out if you have a really aggressive revenue curve and underestimate the feet on the street. And I would say the other part about the customer is then once you have the business, how much is it going to, cost to build out if you are going to build out, or a distribution model, then you have to think about a margin that you have to give over. How much will it cost you to serve your customer then? You've got the customer and then you have the customer retention cost. So whether it's supporting a capital piece of equipment or fielding service calls, or in Elizabeth's case, there's confusion, there's patients. Also, what is the cost to properly serve your customers so that you can also provide optimal customer service?
So it's I think,
So for some,
the budget question is really tied to what you're trying to do. And then are you able to tap into whatever kind of financial markets to raise that kind of money, right? And depending on what stage you're in, you have different class of capital that's available to you, right? But so some of the rules of thumb is it's going to take longer than you think. It's going to cost you more than you think, and you will have lots of traps along the way and unexpected expenses. And as a startup, you don't have that kind of resilience, right? So what most companies end up doing, and that's what we ended up doing. I mean, you are going to wear multiple hats. When we were trying to figure out how to get through the FDA, we talked to all these experts, and we got quotes that would have been more than the total amount of money I had raised in the company. And just to put things in perspective, we were all going without salary for a very long time, right? So our alternative was, okay, find through our friends and family network somebody who could come in as a consultant, but then I ended up writing the whole thing. Okay, I had carpal tunnel syndrome at the end of it because I had never written so much in such a short period of time. Okay, I mean, for lawyers, the same thing. We would use the lawyers for only the things that absolutely were needed, and then try to draft things ourselves, go find templates. I mean, now you can actually find a lot of the standard contracts and templates. So there's ways to save money. I think part of what you have to be aware of, and based on how you describe your journey, Joelle, I have a feeling that you've discovered and learned most of these lessons. I mean, there's a network of service providers and they'll pitch you all kinds of things. You don't necessarily need those and you don't have the resources for it. So I think finding the balance, saying, okay, what can you do yourself? But you don't want to make major mistakes. I mean, if you're going through the FDA process and you can have one or two wrong phrases and that will kill your submission, right? So you need expertise, but I think you can sort of break it out where you're doing a lot of the heavy lifting to keep your costs down. Same with legal, same with finance. Yeah, I mean, there are lots of ways, and eventually, once you got a rhythm and your business is kind of got the broader outline, you will have a better sense of, okay, what are going to be administrative expenses, what are other things, and there are metrics. I mean, you can look at the industry standards for that as you're modeling a business, but it's the process of in the journey to get to that point. You really have to improvise, right? The templates and all are not going to help you necessarily. But mostly you have to be super, I mean, you end up working a lot harder because you don't have the resources by definition.
And resourceful, like leverage networks, right?
Absolutely.
It's asking and leverage networks. And I think especially people are willing to help. And, when especially from a development standpoint, and if you're breaking into a new market, there's opportunities either from a customer base to look at who's publishing in the literature, who is the competition using, looking at KOLs. So, leverage networks, even in the academic center, it's amazing because you can get to purchasers, you can get to nurses, you can get to the patient. Sometimes you can, that goes through approval, but leveraging and asking for help. There's no dumb question. I always tell teams, ask for help.
Yeah.
And the worst that somebody can say is no.
I think that's one of the most important things to keep in mind. And, for someone, so I had to learn that, as an executive coming from tech industry, that was completely foreign to me to ask for
You
help.
knew it all.
No, it's not just that. You try to figure things out, right?
Personality type too, right?
Painful.
Let's be honest, right? So, but just learning to ask for help and calling in all the favors. I called all the favors I could, right? And most of it, and initially I used to feel guilty, but people are happy to help, especially if they feel like what you're engaged in is going to make a difference, right?
Yeah, that's so true.
I was going to say, completely agree with everything you said. It's being able to ask those questions, tap into those people, ask who else you can talk to from those people that you've met. I think for me, coming right out of college, I was like, I need to build a network in this field that I'm brand new to. And people have the answers and they're super happy to give them to you when it comes to like budgets and business models and just clinicians and purchasers. So I think always thinking about expanding that network, as Carly said, is super helpful, and understanding what you don't know so you can ask more about it.
And nurture it, right? Because that's the other thing. It's asking and nurturing. Because I think a simple thank you and those acknowledgments, sometimes is making sure, especially if people are opening up their portfolio of networks and relationships. I think it's also, nurturing that relationship, asking if they want to be updated. Joelle, you guys have a newsletter. I don't know, Elizabeth, if you have anything, you have LinkedIn a lot that you're putting it on, but nurture, keep them informed, and keep those relationships, because they may be the first ones that will adopt your product, especially if it's on a clinician side, or be a champion for your product, or from a venture angel. They have access, they know who has the deep pockets, and they may be able to make the introductions if they see you make progress.
So maybe you guys have some stories about like really great things that happened when you talked to potential funders, and really disastrous things that when you talk to potential funders. Does anything come to mind that would be fun to share?
We really have. And we are on the record, so we
Oh, that's right, we're recording, so. But sometimes, go ahead, Joelle.
Yeah, I won't share any specific stories, but I think something that's interesting to hear about is just going from the academic grant process and then also investors. It's just with grants, you have a very slow timeline. It takes a long time to apply, get everything together, and then be reviewed, and then hopefully you get the money, and that also takes a long time to get into your account. But then with investors, they each have their own thesis, which is like their portfolio theme, and they each have their own red and green flags that they look for. This is with angel investing, different a little bit for venture capital. So I think there's some pains with both of those systems and things you have to learn over time. But I think it's always something that you want to keep looking ahead on. I think for our team, we knew we'd be seeking investment, and we wanted to start building those networks early. We wanted to understand that process early to make sure we were making progress to get to that point where funders would say yes immediately and see the opportunity and see the message that we were promoting.
And A lot of things can be paid for by certain kinds of grants like SBIRs, STTRs, but other things cannot. Can
Yeah, that too.
what have you learned in terms of what cannot be paid for? And if you can't pay for it with your grants, then where do you raise the funding?
Yeah, I think that's something kind of you really have to organize your timeline, your budgets for is like, for example, an SFI core can do customer discovery. So that's very, very valuable for going to conferences and reaching people. Other product, I think SBAR and like We Reach and Promotion Gap, and those are product development. So making sure where you like for, I think one thing for me was realizing that we had to pause on the product development a little bit so we could secure some funding to actually do those next milestones for it instead of trying to chip away over time, do as lean resource as and like only team instead of hiring outside people for it and getting everything fleshed out until you can secure the next funding to do those milestones better or at higher quality. I kind of lost track on answering that question, but I think
No,
it's
I
really
think that was
figuring out
it.
the right opportunities for hitting all those milestones kind of and still making progress on time.
And Elizabeth, do you have multiple sources of funding or is it mostly grant?
We're a little bit of grant, a little bit of pitch money, but mostly federal funding at this point. And we'll be going through partnership for innovation on the NSF. So we'll be staying on that track for a little bit longer.
Yeah, that's great.
We have a clinical trial we have to run first. So
You know, I've been seeing in the healthcare space specifically, think about foundations, private foundations,
Mhm.
or also I've been seeing a lot of the, depending on what it is, for example, the American Academy of Otolaryngology, they have an innovation pitch. The American College of Cardiology has an innovation. American Diabetes Association. So checking out patient as well as clinician groups and advocacy groups and associations. And there are consortiums that are out there as well, international consortiums that are looking for infectious disease, TB, point of care, and those are typically backed by either research associations and or pharma as well. There's also pharma, or there's MedTech Innovator, and then, MedTech Innovator, and then there's also the Pharma Innovator. So you just have to read the fine print to make sure it's non-dilutive. But there are a lot of different innovation groups. Project MedTech is another one. So if you just do a quick Google search, there is a lot. And I also was working with one company that was doing crowdsourcing funding. And so, that's also sometimes I think it's a little bit more difficult, and depending on how much money is being raised, there are some new social ventures and other areas where there's some crowdsourcing similar type opportunities.
Yeah, great. That really widens the horizons. Salish, you were going to share something?
It was, to your original question. So I completely agree with non-dilutive funding. If you can get it, is the way to go, right? Despite all the cons that come with it, because you're also keeping control of your destiny. Because as soon as you take other people's money, suddenly they're all the experts, and they're going to tell you how to run the business. And even though you're the one who educated them on the business, you're smiling. So I suspect you've heard that already. So there were two categories of things. One category that completely drives you nuts is the naysaying, right? It's the nature of the business. 99% of your conversations will go with a no. You'll be hearing a no. So I think the emotional toll it takes is non-trivial, right? So you do have to find a way to deal with that and accept it and manage it and not let it get you down, right? So that's on the negative side. And I think on the positive side, especially in healthcare, I mean, your invention, your work is being used and having an actual impact on somebody's life. That is a high, right? I mean, I still remember the day we got a letter from one of the ER docs who was helping folks and taking care of the folks at the Everest Base Camp. And he was able to use our device to screen out for pulmonary edema. So one guy was having symptoms, but with this, you could tell him, no, you don't have pulmonary edema, you can go climb, right? I mean, that was a big deal. Likewise, we got testimonials from people in Afghanistan where, they were able to triage much more effectively and actually airlift somebody who did have internal bleeding and would have gone into shock, right? So when you get those kinds of tales, and I suspect both you, Elizabeth, and Joel, you that's probably what drives you, right? I mean, that keeps you in the game despite all the naysaying and the obstacles you encounter. And it's very hard to get in other fields. I think healthcare is very special that way.
It really is. And just to echo that, you always find other pockets of people who've been searching for the same answers that you have been. And so when you're able to connect, I'm in Nottingham, England right now with the United Kingdom Clinical Research Facility. It's like 11 o'clock here.
Oh, wow.
But here's this entire network who have said, well, we're trying to keep people on clinical trials too. What do you know? What do we know? And so sometimes even just finding those people in the dark in healthcare and being able to link together also adds credibility. You start adding and compiling those stories. And so it makes your product that much stronger and more agile when you get to approvals.
And Terri, your original question, I think, was the nightmare stories and willing to share, but I can, 2 startups, I mean, one was a rebound, which is great, but I think teams had underestimated the risk of reimbursement. And depending on what the technology is, physicians and hospitals buy and bill. You know, they want to buy the technology and then recoup and have an ROI. And so when we were raising funding, I think we were all surprised when CMS on their final proposal decided to drop the reimbursement from 300 to 70. So Salish similar. Well, guess what? Doctors are not going to buy this anymore. If they can't get reimbursed, they're not going to charge the patient. Or if you underestimate reimbursement and don't have clear medical policies. So teams will hear that, you know, and so we lost potential investors. And then we had to lay off sales team, eventually laid off more, eventually senior leadership was laid off. And then we had fire sale, you know, technology. So you can't underestimate that and being able to show the clinical efficacy, as well as a younger company, what it takes, as I said earlier, getting in the big door. And you have to be able to, when you're raising funds, be able to demonstrate how you can get those wins clearly and how you can get those, you know, the big names behind you to endorse it. They may not buy it right away, but it's going to take time. So it's really thinking about how to de-risk that financial contribution.
And I think it gets more complicated because you really want to also make sure you're not bringing the wrong kind of money on your capital.
That's a good
You
point.
just need one wrong investor to make your life miserable and your company's risk profile go completely off.
So don't be too hungry for funding. Be somewhat the investors involved in what your budget's going to be, or do they want to see a detailed budget from you to start with?
So
I think they're gonna have milestones, right? I mean, if they're going to want to see some type of milestones and prioritize milestones. I've also worked in a company where we burned cash way too fast. And there were some bad decisions, I think, made from a hiring because they just ramped up the sales force very quickly, which was costly. So yes, they are going to want to see some type of milestone and delivery and prioritization and report out. Salish, you probably have way more experience than I do in this.
Well, no, you're absolutely right. And I think the terminology they will use is what's the user proceeds, right? So you're raising money. What are you going to be using the money for? And the way they think about it is that money should be used to increase the value of the company. I.e., you're going to take some basic risks out of the company, and depending on the stage, if it's early stage, you're going to finish a product, you know, whether you're going to go through your regulatory piece or you'll get some market validation. So I think that's the mindset they have, again, to use the terms that Carla, you know, talked about de-risking, right? So think of what are the milestones, the key de-risking and value creation milestones you will get to, and what's the user proceeds? How are you going to use the money? I think that's another fancy way of saying, what are you going to do with this?
Yeah, I could jump in here for a
Yeah,
second.
go ahead, Elizabeth.
Being an investor, I do believe that the question was whether or not you need a specific breakdown of your revenue and endpoints and things like that you're going to use the money for. That's in the chat, and we really find that it's very important to actually put exactly what you're going to achieve from that dollars, not just as in I'm going to interview 500 people, but when I finish 500 interviews, I should have a clear understanding of the additional product features that I need to do, or that a track of revenue, or a commitment from people to be able to sign up and be on the waiting list for me to be informed about how quickly your product is going to come to market.
What Elizabeth said is exactly right. There is a difference though, because if you've got a grant, there are certain things that you absolutely can't charge out for. So, right, there's only certain things that you can put under the scope of the grant. Investor money is typically not like that. It's money given to the company with an expectation that, as Elizabeth said, you're going to get to certain goals. There's another piece associated with that, which is that those goals ought to take you to the next stage of the company, should add enough value so that when you do your next stage of fundraising, you can then show that additional value and raise more money on it. So the goals are not as specific when you're doing angel investing or asking for investment dollars, but I would say there's a longer time frame. Usually a grant is a relatively short period of time. You meet those goals and you get the funding, whereas you're building from round to round on the value of the company when you're looking for investment dollars. Yeah, the grants are more technical proof, if you will. And angel investing, I usually give a rough rule of thumb that it's 50% product and it's 50% company. You know, do you have the right people there? Do you have the funding? Do you understand where your money's going to come from? Do you have a long-term plan for how the product's going to get to market? So the marketing plan becomes very important when you're talking about the investment side.
True, true. Well, thank you. So you speakers, any last wise words for this audience of beginning entrepreneurs?
For me, just embrace the journey, continue, and don't forget to have fun along the way and take time. I think Salish mentioned this earlier, take time so you don't have burnout. There's a lot to do, and I think also to rest and prioritize health and mental health as well.
I think as we talk about expanding networks and meeting more people, it's also just as important to meet other founders. I found that building that community around me in Startup Hall, for example, or other medical device entrepreneurs has been super helpful for me to ask questions and just get someone on the phone and understand the roller coaster, the highs and lows that will come even when it feels like things are going really well. It's good to have other people to bounce similar ideas off of.
Yeah, no, I would say, you know, have a robust support system, for want of a better word, friends, family, who don't expect they'll understand what you're doing, but you know, at least they will pat you on the back when you're down. It's like, it's okay, you know. You're needing a fair amount of that, and you know, pick the problem you want to go after carefully, because you'll be spending a lot of time with it. So make sure it's something you care about deeply. I would say those two things really end up being very, very important.
I would also say keep the urgency. So sometimes, especially maybe after a big L, it's easy to say, you know what, I'll leave this to the side. You know, there's other things, maybe I need to take a big break. Keep the urgency alive. Don't forget your customers are waiting for you. So even though you may have an L that day, don't forget that maybe the next win is around the corner, provided you keep it going.
Great. Well, thank you all. I really appreciate you participating.